Hi, everyone. Welcome to Jacobin Talks. We are going to be joined by Vivek Chibber to talk about the election, the incoming results, um, and where the left goes from here. Before I get to that, I'd like to take a second to plug Jacobin's new issue. It's called Failure is an Option. Probably feels more true when you see that graphic after the election than before. You can go to jacobin.com to subscribe or buy the issue in print on its own. All right, let's get to Vivek and the results of the election. Kale, can you bring up an election or get ready with the U.S. presidential election map for us? Perfect. And Vivek, just to start out, could you sort of summarize the results? It seems like Biden's on a clear path to victory now, but it was incredibly close and continues to be, with Trump saying that he might contest the results. So could you go into some of that?
Yeah, two things to keep in mind. One is that the contentiousness of the process right now is really only a consequence of the really bizarre character of American electoral politics, where in the total popular vote, Biden has won. And he's won by, I think, a larger margin than Hillary Clinton did 4 years ago. And yet, by the actual rules of presidential elections, he's probably going to still win, but it's conceivable that he could lose. And this just goes again to show the backwardness of the Electoral College as an institution and exactly how it's an obstacle to real democratic politics in this country. Now, that said, when you look at what we actually have in the United States is 50 separate elections on November 3rd. We don't have one election for a president. Each state has its own election. Then you add them up. And the way it's gone is shocking. If those of us who follow the polls and who follow the media were all led to believe that this was going to be a comfortable win for Biden and potentially a wipeout. And what it's in fact turned out to be is a squeaker. If he does win, it's going to be by the nose. So where we are right now is most of the networks have Biden at about 264 electoral college votes. He needs 270 to win. So basically, of the four outstanding states, Nevada, North Carolina, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, if he just wins one of those states, he's in, pending whatever legal actions Trump is going to take. So it looks like Biden is going to squeak through. In the legislature, it has been, I think it's safe to say, quite a debacle for the Democrats. They were pretty sure they would at least expand their lead in the House, and they're going to actually lose seats in the House. They were hoping to get a majority in the Senate, and they're not. They're probably going to still be a minority in the Senate. So the best case scenario for the Democrats is that Biden wins the office, but it's a split legislature with the Republicans controlling the Senate and the Democrats with a reduced majority in the House. And that's a bleak scenario for them.
Yeah, so let's talk about the expectations versus reality for a little bit. You're absolutely right that every poll was saying, oh, it's going to sweep for Biden. Trump is on really weak footing. He can't come out. He's not getting the numbers he thinks he's not getting the numbers he had in 2016. So why do you think people got that so wrong? Do you think it was just a flaw with the polls? Do you think it was people underestimating the salience of Trump's message with certain groups of people? Do you think Biden was weaker in particular areas than he was made out to be?
Let's take this step by step. Let's start with the question of why might it have gone wrong? And there are two, possible scenarios here. One, which is being floated, is that it has to do with the echo chamber of the media and the liberal intelligentsia, whereby they are not careful enough about their methods so long as it gives them the answers that they want. There is some of that. I'll get to the media later, hopefully when we have time. There is some of that. But the fact is Fox News and Fox News's own polls also had Biden up by a substantial margin in national polls. They had him last, I think, 6 or 7 points up, as against the 1 or 2 points that he's actually going to win by. So it was across the board, which suggests to me that it's more in the methods that they're using rather than in some sort of bias, whether conscious or unconscious on their part. It doesn't in any way absolve them. After all, this is supposed to be some sort of scientific process that is unfolding here. What's clear, I think, what was probably the case, is that the industry has not caught up with either the culture or the technology that's out there. They don't know how to use it. And because it's an industry, the premium is on having a new poll every 2 days, new poll every 3 days, being on the cutting edge, having 538 give you the grade that you want, 530 itself having its own algorithms validated. So it's like any other commodified capitalist process whereby the focus is on the clicks, the money, the notoriety, rather than on the validity of the results itself. Right now, in my opinion, the polling industry is in shambles. They're going to try to spin it this way. There's just no way you can get around the fact. 2016 was nothing compared to the debacle right now for the polling industry. They have no idea what to do. They just have no conception of how to relate to the actual population. So there's no way to sugarcoat a colossal failure on their part.
Yeah, it's pretty staggering. I also think that there were issues in the way people predicted who would actually turn out for either candidate. We saw Biden really pushing for suburban voters, disaffected Republicans, trying to make sure he seemed like the candidate of the kind of like back to normal, let's make America calm again. Or I think I saw signs that said make America kind again. He was really trying to position himself as like, the good old friendly centrist. I think that he miscalculated how broad the appeal would be there. And I think the polls did as well, which is not to say he should have, been more focused on winning left votes. I just think he didn't understand how many of those kind of center or center right people might actually go over. And then with Trump, people seemed surprised by the fact that he saw increased voter turnout in every demographic except for white men who supported him less this year. Can you talk about some of those misconceptions and the surprises around the base for Democrats and for Republicans this time around?
Yeah, right now, our ability to closely analyze what the turnout was and what the base for each candidate was is very limited because even the exit polls right now are only just starting to come out in any kind of real depth. And frankly, I don't know how much stock to put into exit polls right now. They're always a bit of a gamble because people are rushing out and you're only getting a fraction of the voters because you never get the voters who mailed in their ballots. But right now, these are the same people doing the exit polls who did the opinion polls before the elections. I don't know how much stock to put in it. That said, what information we have is stunning. There's no way around this. Trump, who is, if he's not himself a racist, he definitely trades in racism. We know he's a misogynist. We know that he's corrupt. There's documentary taped evidence that he suppressed our knowledge of what has happening with coronavirus. And in spite of that, in every single demographic, he improved compared to 2016. You can't explain that away. There's no way to explain away the fact that this guy who everybody was sure would lose compared to 2016 with blacks, with Latinos, with women, in fact, ended up doing better. And to my mind, what that tells you is two things. First of all, once again, the strategy of these centrist and right-wing Democrats from 2016 to now, which is the message basically is, we are not him. That's it. That's all they had to say, with a few very, very minimalist and tepid promises as to what they do. That strategy fell flat. It got nobody excited, to the extent that there was a turnout that came that increased when Biden It was not because of Biden. It was not because of the platform. It was not because of the message. It was an anti-Trump turnout. That's it. And Trump, I think, understood that if the main sentiment is anti-Trump, his way out is to energize his base. And that's what he did. He energized his base. And in that process, also picked up more votes in the demographics that the liberal establishment was sure he would lose. Now, why did he pick up with those votes? Okay, right now we're just guessing because we don't have the data. You'll have to make inferences based on which districts came out, what the breakdown was, and we don't have those right now. But if I had to ballpark it, I would say something like this, is that they looked at how the Democrats actually deal with issues that are important to Black Americans, to Latinos, to women, and a sizable chunk of them said, this stuff isn't real. This doesn't touch my life. That it's condescending, it's patronizing, it's elitist, and I would rather go with this guy, Trump, who at least hates the establishment or in some way promises me a better future. The kind of particular kind of race and gender politics that the Democrats have been pushing, which is very, very elite politics around these identity issues, is one that is just not landing with a significant chunk of those populations. Nobody on the left should be surprised about this. Nobody on the left should be surprised because the hallmark of a Marxist or socialist analysis is not to see these groupings, women, Blacks, Latinos, as undifferentiated blobs, which is exactly how the woke left looks at them, but to see them as differentiated populations with distinct classes, distinct interests, and which are going to align themselves not simply on the basis of symbols, on discourse and identity, but also on their economic interest. And also, I'll say, they will also react to the paternalistic, patronizing approach that liberals have when it comes to these people, to the individualism that liberals espouse, to the inwardness, the narcissism, the emptiness, the commodification, the commitment to the market. A lot of what we call conservatism wrongly is also a reaction against some of the worst aspects of commodified life. But in the progressive and liberal left, that is inevitably labeled conservative, backward, communitarian, and therefore right-wing. The left has no way of dealing with working class people or middle class people who value things like the family, who value things like parenthood, like community, like the church. The left always had a way of understanding this without being absorbed into it. Right now, it just doesn't, because we can talk about this later. The left is really an offshoot right now of liberal culture. It's not something that's distinct from it. So they react. This is my reading of it, and like I said, this is it's kind of an inference and a guess. This is my reading of it. We shouldn't exaggerate this because the vast majority of Blacks and Latinos still went with Biden. But you also cannot ignore the fact, after 4 years of this dude in office, he increased his vote in these populations. That goes against everything that the liberal media and the progressive left told you that you should expect. And I think the only way to understand it is through some sort of materialist analysis like this.
Yeah, I spent the morning listening to Black conservatives talking about their politics, and one woman remarked that when she looked at the Democrats, they, would say, we support you, like we'll pull this hot sauce out of our bag. And when she looked at Trump, he said, we support you, we'll give you a tax cut. And I think people have a hard time understanding, the variety of political decisions people are making based off of their material reality or their perceptions of it, right? So if you have people who feel like they finally got a leg up to be a small business owner and they feel that that's under threat, they're going to make very different political calculations. And it may not be as important to them to see one or another person represented when they feel like there's an immediate threat to their material well-being. And Trump, in his rhetoric, was very, very good at playing on that. Kale, can you bring up Trump talking about his what he's done for the economy?
Together we built the greatest economy in history, and now we're doing it again. Make America great again, right? Again. See all those hats? Those hats are obsolete. It's Make America Great Again, again. We increased middle-class family income over $6,000 more than 5 times the gains made under the last administration. Think of that in a short period of time. African American, Hispanic American, Asian American unemployment reached their lowest levels ever recorded. Since April, we created a record 11.4 million jobs. I ended the NAFTA nightmare and proudly signed the brand new USMCA into law.
So you can see from that clip, what gets lost in the way that people approach Trump and his rhetoric is that they focus on the more bombastic, aggressive, incredibly offensive things that he does, or they make fun of him and make fun of his base. But the economic changes that he's talking about really resonate with a lot of people. They continue to resonate with a lot of people. That has to be part of what drove turnout for him this time. And those people are people of all different races. And he hasn't ignored that in his messaging. He just simultaneously continues to do his, I don't even know what's more obvious than a wink, like kissing cheeks with white supremacists, I guess, because it gives him the veneer of a populist. But at the same time, he's trying to talk to the real economic concerns that other people have. And I want to bring up Biden's kind of overtures and his economic program just for a second, so we can dig into that a little bit and see the other side.
We reduced the corporate tax rate from 35%, and Democrats and Republicans who were in office thought it should come down to 28%. He reduced it to 21%. You have 91 out of every of the Fortune 500 companies not paying a single solitary penny. If you raise the corporate tax just back to 28%, which is a fair tax, you'd raise $1.3 trillion by that one act. If you made sure the people making over 400 grand paid what they did in the Bush administration, 39.6%, you would raise another, it goes up to, let me get you the exact number here, about another $92 billion.
So I was wondering if we could talk about the Democrats' plan for the economy. What do you think did resonate with voters this time? And do you think, any part of Biden's platform is responsible for the more lukewarm turnout that we saw? Or it's hard to say because the polls were so wrong. It's hard to say, oh, Biden didn't get this thing he was supposed to get. But if you think that had any effect on the turnout, I'd love to know.
Look, Biden didn't have much of a platform. Let's be clear about this. And to be honest, neither did Trump. This was one of the most vacuous presidential campaigns in American history. Now, that's why Trump's resounding success, despite that, is something that we just have to kind of wait and try to make sense of. And I'm not going to pretend to have a great answer as to why Trump has been as successful. I'll hazard some guesses if there's time later. I've already made some guesses. But there are a couple of things we should keep in mind. In a winner-take-all system, in a two-party winner-take-all system, it's very hard to disentangle a vote for candidate A from a non-vote for candidate B. That is to say, if I'm voting for Trump, it doesn't mean I like Trump. It just means I may dislike him less than the other guy. So making inferences on why either one of them won or lost is hard to do without looking at the other person, right? Now, in this case, I think a couple of things stand out. One is that neither of these candidates really reached out to the working class in this campaign. Compared to 2016, Trump's campaign was a whole different kettle of fish this time around. There wasn't anywhere near that populism, the anti-establishment message, all that stuff that we saw in 2016. There were elements of it here and there, but fundamentally he ran on a law and order and a kind of general economic prosperity campaign. Open it up, open up the economy, get jobs going again. Not, I'm going to take on the wealthy, I'm going to raise your wage. He didn't even say he supports a minimum wage this time, which last time he did, right? So it's not like Trump doubled down on his populism and got people to come out. Biden, on his part, it was basically Hillary's campaign again. It had some economic promises, but fundamentally he ran on two things. Number one, I'm not Donald Trump. That was his main thing. I'm not Donald Trump. And the second thing was, coronavirus is real. We got to do something until we deal with it. We're not going to be able to get anything else going again. But what is that other thing that you want to get going again? What is it that's going to come after? It's almost crickets. When pushed, he said, yeah, I support a minimum wage. When he was told, what about your medical plan? He vaguely said there's going to be a public option and we'll expand it. And then he didn't say anything more. Now, a public option building on Obamacare, and the fact is Obamacare is not very popular. People don't want to take it away because they don't want to have the pre-existing conditions defense taken away from them. But the rest of Obamacare is not very popular. So whereas we know that the 80% of all the Democrat voters support single payer and Medicare for all, when confronted with that, he said, I will never do that. In every debate, Biden distanced himself from the populist wing of his party. Now, it's true that Trump also didn't make overtures to populism, but Trump, I think, in his followers' minds, so embodies an anti-establishment position, even though he governed as a kind of Paul Ryan Republican this time around. Somehow, he has managed to maintain that image with his followers. In Biden's case, a lot of the left was saying this, and nobody paid it. I mean, the Democrat establishment ignored it. Biden ran with an eye to the suburbs. The whole point was to turn the suburbs away from Trump back to him. And he made no overtures to the working class. All he said to them was, this guy drove the economy into a tank, and we're going to have to get it started again. And the gamble on his part was, and the Democrats was, that this would be enough to win. Now, technically, it has been enough to win. And I'll tell you this, they're going to learn nothing from this. We'll talk, Ariella, there's time later. We should talk about what the future portends for the Democratic Party. But my short version right now is this. They're going to learn nothing from this because they're winning. But if you look at the Republicans right now and what they're saying from this defeat, they're saying that our future is a multiracial working class coalition with some the elements of the suburban vote. So whereas the Democrats should be pushing the multiracial working class coalition, they don't even want to mention it. Right now, it's the Republicans who are talking about it. And I think that has to have affected turnout. It has to have affected turnout.
Yeah, I did hear commentary, I think on PBS, saying the Republicans in 2016 were the party of the white working class, and now they're the party of the multiracial working class. That is really not ground that we want to seed. And in keeping with that line of thought, where do you think the left goes from here? How do you think this changes the terrain that we're fighting on? And what do you think we need to be thinking about in the short term?
The short term is going to be a Biden presidency in which he's going to do very little. And he's going to do very little because he never wanted to do very much. There were these fantasies that he wouldn't be FDR or anything, but if they swept both chambers of the legislature, they would pass an ambitious support package and perhaps a much more ambitious version of Obamacare with a real public option or something. I think that's all off the table now. So the short run is a Biden presidency, which won't do much. And I think there's a pretty decent likelihood that he tries to cut a deal with the Republicans. And so we'll get a garden variety DLC kind of what they call centrist neoliberal administration. And if by the left we mean the socialist left, it's going to, in many ways, I think, have its work cut out for it, because the institutional space to push Biden further to the left isn't going to be as great as it would have been had the election turned out the way he wanted it to. But I also think a deeper problem that the left has to confront, which is, the DSA and socialists have had a lot of success running on Democratic ballot lines, and they will continue to do that. I think in local elections, there's still going to be a lot of scope to win on that. But what's really buoyed and pushed the growth of the DSA in the past 5 years has been the presidential campaigns of someone like Bernie Sanders and the pulpit that he was able to use to change the political culture, to put redistribution and democratic demands back on the agenda, to make a push for universalistic sort of policy changes for Medicare, the environment, et cetera, back on the agenda. And I think people are hoping that in 2024, 2028, another figure comes along to carry that momentum forward. I think that strategy is going to now be much more unlikely than it was in 2016 or 2020 for the left. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that it's pretty clear now that the Democrats see their future as being a combination of an electoral strategy that is a combination of a reliance on the suburban vote and the Black and Latino political establishment to deliver the minority vote, the Black vote, the Latino vote. And the key point here is that it's the minority establishment that they're going to rely on, not the activists, the organizers, et cetera, because that latter group, the activists and the organizers, are going to raise demands that are going to turn off the suburban vote. So it's going to be think of it this way, the kind of multicultural suburban population. That is to say, the growing Black population in the suburbs, the influx of Latinos in California and on the West Coast that they think they can have the elites delivered to them. And that makes a presidential campaign of the sort of Bernie Sanders very difficult, because the social base of the Democratic Party now is the social base of the Elizabeth Warrens of the world. It's the professional class, it's the people in the top 35% of the population. And the younger ones in them are okay with a minimal social democratic program, because the younger ones are in the gig economy, they don't have healthcare, they don't have permanent jobs, and they want some sort of social wage, some sort of social insurance, but they don't vote. So among the people who do vote, it's going to be hard to push it through. And Sanders helped the Democrats coalesce around this agenda. The second problem that they have to contend with is the primaries are set up in a way it's going to be almost impossible for a progressive to get through Super Tuesday. Because as long as the Congressional Black Caucus is as reactionary as it is right now, as neoliberal as it is, and as faithful to the centrist Democratic Party agenda, as long as they have that orientation and they are able to deliver the vote in the southern states on Super Tuesday, they are a firewall, in my opinion, against any left candidate, Black or white, getting through. Right? So this is the recipe here for the Democratic Party for the near future is a kind of woke neoliberalism. And a Sanders-style campaign in the future is going to have a hard time, because now they know the formula for defeating it. Even if it's AOC, even if it's a person of color, you're going to find that it's going to be shut out. And frankly, no other Democrat has the cachet, has the resonance with ordinary Americans that Bernie did. So the problem we're facing, I think, on the left is it's easy to fool yourself into saying that we can win local elections and gather power, but you're not going to gather up power through local elections. I mean, it's a swamp, and you're most likely to be absorbed into the electoral process. Without a national campaign, it's going to be hard to grow. Those national campaigns are going to be difficult to be as successful in as you were in 2016. So the only way out is you cannot have a strategy focusing exclusively or primarily on the electoral road. You have to build a base outside of it. You're going to have to be physically implanted in the working class. You're going to have to be in the neighborhoods. You're going to have to be in the workplace and building some sort of established presence over there, because the electoral road, as if you're going through the Democrats, the electoral road is going to be very, very hard. This is my surmise in the near future. The final point is this, Ariella. The natural base for the left to deploy the electoral road, that base is moving over to the Republican Party. It's not all there yet, and I'm talking obviously about the working class. It's not all there yet. It's still split about 50-50. But if you look at the last 40 years, there's no way around this. The Democratic Party is hemorrhaging working class voters. They're going over to the Republicans. Now, how are you going to run in the Democratic primary if the electoral base of that party has a shrinking natural constituency for social democratic politics? It's going to be very hard. And when you look at where the left is today, ideologically, culturally, I just don't see it equipped to deal with this reality.
Yeah, I think speaking to your first point, you can see exactly the pivot you were talking about with the Democratic Party with Kamala Harris just in the course of this campaign. She is vocally in support of Medicare for all. You know, she's speaking primarily to Californians. She's not on the national stage yet. She gestures towards progressive policies. And then when she's on the Biden ticket, she's like, I'm not a socialist. I would never say stuff like that. I'm here to work. I'm here to work across the aisle. I'm here to offer my perspective as a Black woman to inform the decisions of Joe Biden's administration going forward. She almost said that verbatim in a clip that I forgot to give to Kale. Yeah, so I think we're facing, I absolutely see that. The Democratic Party has shown pretty decisively over the last 8 years that they're not interested in really speaking to the issues of the working class. And, oh, yeah.
Let me say this. We saw this in England with the Labour Party. And I really believe, I can't prove it yet, but in the near future, I hope to be able to prove it. I really believe that we're seeing it in this cycle with the Democrats. It was very obvious in the primaries, but I also think it was the driving motive in the presidential campaign. Biden did not fundamentally run a campaign against Trump. Biden's campaign was fundamentally about managing the left. So I want to amplify what you're saying, and people need to they need to wrap their heads around this. The Democratic Party sees the Sanders wing of the party as a bigger threat than Donald Trump. And they would rather see a Republican victory than to see the ascendance or the growth and power of the Sanders wing. And the reason I'm saying this is the following. Every opportunity he got, Biden distanced himself from the left. He didn't just distance himself. He heaped scorn on the left. Now, I don't know how much of an effect that had on turnout. It may or may not have, but that's not important here because it's telling us something about the strategic orientation of the party. The party basically feels it can win on the suburban vote and the Black establishment and perhaps the Latino establishment. But I think with this drubbing today, they might have second thoughts about this, but they know they can rely on the Black establishment. Okay, so that's their strategy. And his victory today, I think, because he won, the lesson that they're going to take home is, yeah, we won by the skin of our teeth, but we did win, and we can continue to win on this because the costs of bringing in the Sanders people and giving them the show is just too great for us. We'll have to fundamentally transform the party, and a lot of them probably believe that they can't win if these people come in. They won't even try, right? So if you look at what he did, the whole thing was about, in this presidential campaign, was about managing the left, not about energizing it, mobilizing it, but managing it and telling the suburbs, you don't have to worry about me. You don't have to worry about me. He kept saying, don't you know me? Don't you know? I mean, that's an amazing thing to say. This guy was validating his last 40 years, the guy who built up the prison system, the guy who was in the pocket of all the credit agencies, the guy who's his whole life has been a political chameleon, embraced it. Why is he embracing it? Because the people who he's reaching out to are his funders and the suburban electoral base, right? So this campaign was one in which he was basically more worried about his left than about the right. And that's why in the past 3 weeks, he saw this astonishing development of him making overtures to Republicans to join his cabinet. Not one whisper about the left wing of the party joining the cabinet, but the Republicans joining the cabinet. So in my opinion, Biden, to some extent, is going to be relieved that the Republicans won the Senate. It lets him off the hook. And he can actually cut a deal with them now. Why? Because there's a big wing, we haven't talked about this yet, but there's a big wing of the Republican Party that's also right now anxious. Because whereas for the Democrats, Biden's victory is going to be seen as a validation, however weird, a validation of their strategy and a reason not to rethink anything. But the Republicans, the fact that Trump did so much better than anybody has expected is going to send a tremor through the party, because the establishment of the Republican Party was thinking it's going to be one and done with this guy. He's going to be gone, and the Romney, Ryan, McConnell wing of the party can bring back business as usual, right, and take over. And they now they look out and they say, this is not going to be such an easy move for us. Trumpism is going to get a boost from the performance today. So there is some now, I think, impulse in both of these parties to come together and discipline and shunt aside these more populist elements inside their parties. And this gives Biden the opportunity to cut a deal. I don't know, maybe we'll see echoes once again of Obama's grand bargain and the effort he made in his presidency then to cut a deal with the Republicans, maybe something like that. But there's also some incentive for McConnell to give some way, even though I think it's unlikely. I think they're going to try to tank Biden's presidency so they can take back the House in 2022. But there's going to be some impulse to do so, right? So for the Democrats, therefore, this is a pretty good turnout in that Biden's winning validates, however distorted that validation is, it validates the current preoccupation with woke neoliberalism and the suburbs. And you're going to see that, I think, going forward.
So how do you think the Republican Party will reorient after this? Because as you said, they didn't expect Trump to do as well this time around. They're going to have to change their political calculus. They could make overtures to Biden to seem like they're reaching across the aisle, and maybe as they reach, pull all of those Republicans that switched back over with them. But it also seems like, particularly in certain state races, they wouldn't want to alienate Trump's base. Can you talk to how they may reorient after this moment?
Well, there's two issues involved. In American politics, remember, there's the electoral base and then there's the funder, the donor class, and you have to worry about both of them. Let's start with the donor class. The tea leaves were not looking very good for Trump when it comes to money in the past 6 months. As we know, Biden vastly outraised him. And even though there are still these kind of very extremist wings of the American capitalist class, the Koch brothers and people around them, who are very happy with Trump, it's not so clear how that donor class is going to respond to this. And my feeling is Trump's tried so hard in these past 4 years to win them over. And the fact that he's still a viable candidate, all they care about is somebody who can carry out their agenda. And now, since Trump, the moment he took office, abandoned all his populism, and he just became basically a garden variety Republican with some protectionism, which apparently they can live with, they might come back to him. I think they'd abandon him, and they might come back to him, which gives Trumpism now a material basis, a financial basis inside the party. And what makes it especially attractive then is the second thing, which is, Biden did not increase the Democratic Party's base in this election. He won by flipping some of the old Democrats in the suburbs who had gone over Trump in the 2016 election, and in bringing back some of the working class voters. But he didn't expand the base as far as we can tell. Trump has expanded their base. This is a huge achievement. In a country where the demographic facts seem to be going against the Republican Party, and people like Rui Teixeira, were writing in 2000, the early 2000s, even more recently, that the demographic growth is playing into the hands of the Democratic Party, and that there's no way the Republicans can deal with this. The Republicans are seeing, even if we can't get the black vote, the Latino vote might be a real possibility for us. And we can get the working class with this combination of a kind of revanchist racism on the one hand, these culture wars, and a populism. For a Republican Party that's been searching for a strategy in a rapidly changing demographic population, this gives them something like a viable strategy, right? So what do we expect of the Republican? I think it's too early to tell. The Republican Party is going to be roiled by this, just as the Democrats have been, because nobody expected this in the Republicans. They were already planning for a post-Trump future, I think. But this is going to give Trumpism, if not Trump himself, it's going to give Trumpism a lease on life. And I think ideologically, it might even become ascendant. Now, can it work? Can they carry it out? I don't know. But I think we should expect to see some real conflicts, real debates inside the party as to where it's going to go going forward. And being out of power means those debates are going to be ugly. You know what? The way in the United States, because neither of these is actually a party. What happens is whoever is president, whichever Republican has become president, within 4 years, everyone's been saying, this is the future of the Republican Party. The Bush people were saying, this is going to be our party forever. Donald Trump is elected. He's a pariah. Within 3 years, 2 to 3 years, all the papers are saying, this is now Trump's party. Because what happens is, since the whole party just exists to raise money and to run for elections, because of the magnetic power of the presidency and the enormous leverage that it has, they are able to, a president who knows what he's doing is able to really bring over the party around himself. And since the party members, the electors, the politicians are basically just mercenaries, they say, this is great, we can live with this, right? So for that, what that does is it squelches conflict inside the party. It drives it underground. But now that they're out of power, that conflict's going to percolate up. And I don't pretend to know how it's going to be resolved. What I'm saying is Trumpism now has a real lease on life inside the party. It also, I think, is going to have some support within sections of American capital who think this guy, his people can get it done for us. And that means that they're going to be a viable and a formidable force for the near future, I think.
Pivoting away from the kind of domestic side of everything, I mean, I think it's clear that the left has its work cut out, the socialist left has its work cut out for it in terms of building a real working class base, in terms of working for change outside of electoralism. But I want to focus on what we can expect from a Biden presidency and a kind of Trumpism, Republican lean in terms of foreign policy and international issues. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little. I know it's a huge, huge topic, but I think in one way that has been an incredibly consistent part of American politics. We can have, you know, the most divided nation, and then externally it's business as usual for imperialism. So I was just wondering if you could speak to what we might see under a Biden presidency.
There are two components to American foreign policy. One that everyone pays attention to is the militarism and the diplomacy. That's one. The second component, which is followed less closely, is American financial policy abroad and the management of the dollar. When it comes to management of the dollar, I don't think there was any great departure in the Trump presidency. There was still the same commitment to defending it in the short run, to making sure that the Federal Reserve was really the bank of the last resort for the global economy and not just for the American economy. And in this crisis, in Catalyst, Rama Vasudevan had a really great article in the previous issue on how during COVID, even as the US state bumbled its way through domestic interventions to contain the virus, in its international interventions, it was extremely effective and very, very quick in how fast it moved. And so the Trump administration on that simply built on the momentum of the past 20 to 25 years. On that dimension, you should see not even a ripple. I think Biden will continue to try to manage it as best he can. Now, whether he's able to or not, it's a different matter. What we're talking about is the orientation of the administration. There's, as we would expect, complete continuity between the Republicans and the Democrats. Now, on
just real quick, oh, sorry, just real quick, I want Cale to bring up one of the graphs that's U.S. Treasuries offering diminishing returns. This is sort of what you're talking about with the financial strategy that the United States employed during COVID. Just got to scroll down.
Yeah, that's more on the domestic side, of course, that graph.
Yeah.
It's not on the
sorry,
international
we're finding side. the one about U.S. Treasuries. It's just all the way at the bottom. And so this was actually saying in this Financial Times article exactly what you were saying. This policy will be consistent. The dollar is a safe haven globally. People are seeing, potential market shocks, and they still see the United States as a viable and secure place. And so you're saying that will continue into a Biden presidency.
Banks and other currencies, not just the dollar, because it understands its role as a global manager of currencies and not just the dollar as a currency. And that's because the Fed also has a great deal of autonomy from the American president. So that we should not expect to see any real changes in that. With regard to diplomacy, I think what we should expect to see is a return to a re-engagement with NATO. Instead of saber rattling and saying that the U.S. is going to leave NATO, we should expect to see a greater involvement in the Middle East than we've seen so far. Probably a return to some sort of deal with Iran, which Trump pulled out of. Even Trump would have come to the table eventually with Iran as well. They're trying right now to reorient the regional politics around Israel once again, and the Gulf states as a bulwark against Iran. But I just don't think there's any way for that to be effective. Iran's going to be calling the shots, I think, in the Middle East for the foreseeable future. And I think Trump would have come around if he had won a second term. In the case of a Biden presidency, I think you're going to probably see that anyway. And you'll probably see more militarism than Trump, not less. Trump actually was less aggressive an imperialist than Obama had been. And I think that's because Trump he wasn't very interested in being a president. He liked his face on the screen, but he didn't really have much of an agenda. He didn't really have much of a strategy or vision of what he wanted to do abroad. He did pull American troops out of Syria. He did lessen the American presence in Afghanistan. He did all these things. And you saw the Democratic establishment and the liberal media, the New York Times, just going berserk over this, right? But it, in fact, was a weakening of the American footprint in Western and in Southern Asia. I think what you should see under Biden is a return to what liberals will call American responsibilities, but what the left would call more aggressive imperialism. I would imagine you'll see that. And the Republicans in the Senate will have no problem with that whatsoever. So this is one instance in which the Biden presidency politically could be a step backward, not forward.
What do you think about Biden's relationship with China?
Oh, I mean, I think what you'll expect is that diplomatically they'll both be fine. There are political scientists and scholars who think that there's a long-term antagonism that's going to be inevitable between the U.S. and the China. I don't see it. It's just not fruitful for either country. They see it as kind of the rivalry between Germany and England or something like that 100 years ago, and nothing like that is on the cards. What you should expect to see a smoothening of economic relations, fewer tariffs, lowering of those tariffs. Yeah, you should expect to see that, frankly. But I'll be honest with you, I don't think the left has a dog in this fight. There's this notion that what the left should be pushing for is this tariff-based regime which brings back jobs. Tariffs don't bring back jobs. But tariffs, what they are, is a tax on the working class, unless they're accompanied by some sort of balancing industrial policy. What tariffs fundamentally do is they raise the price on consumer goods, which then the working class has to pay to subsidize American corporations. Unless that comes with some industrial policy or some sort of planning to generate real jobs, to increase the competitiveness of American industry, to increase the skills of American workers, all they're going to do is slow down the hemorrhaging of capital from the country. It's not going to reverse it.
Yeah.
And this is one
Tariffs
place where I
need
thought
something
Sanders,
to protect. You
I
need
just thought
something to
Sanders
protect
was,
with tariffs.
yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
just-
And I'll be honest, it's a fantasy that you're going to bring back manufacturing without a massive industrial policy in the United States. Every advanced industrial country, but for one or two, is deindustrializing. This is a natural part of capitalism. The focus of the left should not be on manufacturing jobs per se. The focus of the left should be on gainful employment, social security, social insurance, redistribution. You can have a commitment to maintain a manufacturing presence, but that's hard to do. Capitalism is a very, very difficult beast to tame if you want to play the game of being in a capitalist economy. So Sanders and Warren were both very weak on this, on insisting simply on a tariff regime without having a very aggressive interventionist stance on the economy. Without that, I don't think tariffs are going to get you very far. So when Biden brings down those tariffs, don't see that as a great betrayal in and of itself. By themselves, tariffs don't do much. They are also a kind of betrayal. I wouldn't lose a lot of sleep over the change in the trading stance towards China, personally. I would lose a lot of sleep over the way in which the relations with China are used to assist the Chinese government in suppressing labor movements and labor struggles in that country. That's something Trump would have done himself anyway. There's no daylight between a Biden and a Trump presidency on that issue.
Before we get to some kind of wrap-up questions and take some questions from the audience, I just want to ask about immigration. It has been a huge issue during Trump's administration. People do point out the continuities between Obama's immigration policies. He deported more people than Trump. Trump is not at all shying away from the image of him as an incredibly cruel and carceral, as having incredibly cruel carceral immigration policies. So I wanted to see how you think that'll fare under a Biden administration. It seems to be such a core issue that Biden has to make overtures to that. But are we going to go back to a kind of like softer, millions deported over 4 years, Obama-style immigration policy? Or do you think there will be something in the middle?
I don't see any reason to suppose that it won't be a return to Obama. Too many negatives in that. I see every reason to assume that there will be a return to the Obama status quo on this. Biden, notice, has said next to nothing about his immigration policy. What he's done is condemn, as he should, the cruelty, the inhumanity of what Trump carried out. But there's nothing in the way of an alternative. What he said is that, yeah, Obama could have done better, but he's left it at that, which makes you think that basically what he wants is a return to the status quo, because that's what he knows works. Can we name a single issue on which Biden has an idea of his own? Not even one.
He's very clear that he's not. I wish he brought some of the vigor he had when he was screaming at Anita Hill to this campaign.
No, I don't see any. Biden has not offered a transformative agenda on any issue at all. There are 2 or 3 in which you can see an incrementalist agenda. Healthcare is one, perhaps the environment, and he has finally signed on to a minimum wage increase, and that's good to see. But none of this can be called transformative in any way, and I think that's part of the reason no one was very excited about him and why he's in the predicament that he's in now.
Yeah. And it's part of the core of his campaign strategy was to, listen to a set of disparate voices asking for very different things and say, you know what, I'm absolutely not going to give you the thing that you didn't like. I'm not ever going to do that. I would never even do that. I've been giving people the things they like for 40 years. So keep voting for me.
Except working people. I mean, it's pretty
Yeah.
clear what working people want in this country, and he told them to go F themselves.
No, he said, well, there's a real problem with I think that socialists have made gains in terms of putting forth policies that are very popular. I wanted to speak to you about how we translate that popularity into real gains. I don't think we have time for that today, so maybe we can do another the state of the left in America after Biden talk. But I feel like Biden's core concern is taking socialism back to being a slur and making all of those policies that are comprehensive, popular reforms for working class people seem like a pipe dream, or seem or play into the kind of Republican, oh, this is socialism, it's big government. They have no interest whatsoever in acknowledging the amount of working class support for those policies, or that they address the real needs of the working class. And you see it time and time again with every politician but Sanders saying, oh, well, of course we want you to have free college. We can give that to, the 13% of people who drive a Honda, and make sure that they get this much mileage. It's always these really specific, bizarre, means-tested programs, because that equivocation is a way of gesturing towards issues that they think may animate a small amount of people, without putting forth any kind of comprehensive policy that might alienate other people. And rather than defend those policies,
let's be specific, or alienate their social base.
Yes.
Which is the top 30% of the population. Upper middle class, the middle class and upper middle class base, right?
Yeah.
It can piss off other working people. They don't give a shit about that.
That's fine.
They don't think they need them.
Yep, that's totally true.
Yeah, I interrupt you. You were leading up to, you wanted to say something?
Oh, well, I was going to say that, rather than mount a defense of the needs of the working class, they fold. And it's easier. And I think it's because both parties have set up these pseudo-populisms, where Republican pseudo-populism, it's a kind of nasty descendant of Tea Partiers who were nationalists, protectionists, sometimes racist, deeply tax averse, bizarre smatterings of libertarianism speckled in there. And at the same time emerged the anti-birther, Obama's a real American, woke neoliberal end of things, saying, hey, we have just as much expertise, we're just as educated as the rest of you, why aren't we getting our due? Focusing on issues around inequality and discrimination that are very much in the camp of, upper educated or upper class people and what they're facing. Not to say that's not real, but that's the center of the focus. And those constituencies are actually pretty small, right? Like, they're not a huge part of their base. Democrats aren't mostly like woke neoliberals who have cool technocratic ideas about teaching Black girls how to code, but they love to appear that way. And Republicans aren't all boogaloo boy white supremacists, gearing up for a race war. But playing to these very small segments can help them appear to have populist support and be pushing forth populist policies, when all they're really doing is like spinning in that rhetoric. And we don't really see changes. The reason there's disaffected people of color switching over is because they're tired of hearing, like, we put a Black man in power, hooray, like, we support your right to wear your hair however you want to. People that don't need those kinds of changes in their life, by and large. And so both parties have evacuated huge parts of the working class from their platforms. Republicans have pulled in a little bit more than Democrats, but neither of them care to engage with them, particularly after Sanders left the race, because they can get enough attention with their pseudo-populist battles. And I think one of the biggest flaws in the left is that we engage in those battles of pseudo-populism. We don't really need to, talk about identitarianism or talk about white supremacy all the time. We can build a base. We can build working class power by talking about people's real needs. I think one of the most interesting things we saw in this election was Florida turning for Trump and passing a $15 minimum wage, which, yes, will go into effect in 2026. But, that's a great win. That's something that the working class needs. That's something they fought for. I think you see similar things with legalizing recreational marijuana, decriminalizing drugs. I think we're seeing these populist and progressive ballot measures pass in states where we may not expect it, because those small niche issues have resonated with enough people. But I think both parties have basically said, we don't really need that. After Sanders dropped out, we don't have to speak to that portion of people. If they get frustrated and they drop out of politics and they get tired and demoralized, who cares? Sorry, that was a very long screed.
So you wanted me to speak to what part of that?
I wanted you to speak to how do we go from having popular policies, having policies that working class people by and large support and the majority of them support, to actually implementing those? Or is that possible at this juncture at all?
No, it's not even remotely, because you're skipping a step. Implementing policies of the kind that a socialist left would support is simply not on the cards right now, because it requires some kind of power. So the question that should be asked is, how can the left get enough traction in American politics where it can actually it can be a player, some sort of force to push and put on the agenda the policies that have really wide resonance and real popularity in the population? That is the question. And I think the answer to that question is quite, in some ways, simple, but simple only because saying it also shows you how hard it would be to achieve. You've got to break out of the milieu that the left inhabits right now, which is a very small cloistered milieu within the professional class, largely unconnected from the lives of working people. Now, the electoral gains that the DSA has made are real, and they're tremendous, and they're better than anything we've seen in about a half century. They need to be built upon. But as I said earlier, you're not going to go very far if you simply keep pushing the electoral road. You're going to have to build power in neighborhoods and in workplaces and the way you do that is you use the electoral gains to establish beachheads in cities, in communities, in municipalities, and then you use those beachheads to build a real physical presence in the lives of working people, a permanent presence, not just for 6 months so you can go door knocking until the next election comes around, but where you integrate yourself into the lives of these people. That's the first step. Right now, what is called the left is inhabiting the same cultural, political, moral universe as the people who it criticizes. The liberals, conservatives, etc. The left is a part of that. Politics in America right now is tribal warfare within the top 20% of the population. The left is within that top 20%. The only way forward is if you break out of it. If you get out of this stuff and you integrate yourself into the lives of working people, not just during the election cycle, but outside that cycle. If the left doesn't do that, it's dead in the water. It'll become a service organization or a rump inside the Democratic Party or a kind of NGO that does door knocking for progressive Democrats. That's its future, unless it finds a way of breaking out of the electoral cycle, even though it's very important to stay in that, and B, most importantly, the incredibly elite circles that it currently inhabits. It just won't matter until it does that.
Thanks, Vivek. I think that's a great place to end things. Everybody go outside, leave your communities, and embed yourself in a working class neighborhood.
I mean, it's a
No,
simple,
I absolutely agree
get,
with you.
there is a way to do it. You can't do it
Mhm.
as like do-gooding, philanthropy, charity kind of thing. It has to be, there's an organizational way to do it, and maybe in the future sometime we can talk about that. We've only just scratched the surface. But
Yeah.
the model of woke neoliberalism that the Democrats right now are deploying is only 1 or 2 degrees of separation away from the cultural universe of the left. And if they don't figure out a way, the reason that's so is that the left's reference group is that same class that the Democrats are appealing to. They need to get out of that class.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I like this election talk because it ended with us realizing that we shouldn't be paying that much attention to it, and we need to build another movement elsewhere. So I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much, Vivek Chibber, for talking to us about all of this tonight. I look forward to having you back. I'd absolutely love to talk about how we build the left on the ground, a party for the working class.
Sure, it was my pleasure, Ariella. Thank you very much. And things could have been worse. Trump could have won. So even though
we've got that.
It is still a step forward.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.